Welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast, hosted by Dave Roberts. Humanity possesses a unique skill, the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This podcast embraces that ability, offering learning opportunities through conversations with extraordinary guests. Dave aims to leave a positive mark on individuals around the world. So before you dive into today's episode, please share this podcast with your network, including friends, family, and colleagues. And please consider leaving a rating or review. Your support makes all the difference.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. And today it is my pleasure to have as my guest Miki Nguyen. Miki has a very interesting history and a very interesting story about his days in Vietnam, particularly during the Vietnam War and the last days of Saigon. And we're going to have a conversation with him complete with pictures. So for those of you who are going to see this on YouTube, you're going to see some history, you're going to see some context. And this is a conversation that I have been looking forward to for some time now. So Miki, welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast. It's an absolute pleasure having you here today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to sharing this family story with you and your audience. So again, thank you.
Yes, and I also know as a result of what happened almost 50 years ago in Vietnam, there's a book of your father's writings in Vietnamese newspapers called The Last Flight Out, and it's basically his life's work. And I know we're going to get into that as well, too, for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That, as a matter of fact, right now, as we're talking here, this is middle of April, 2025. You're right. 50 years ago is when our family had to escape Vietnam in a very dramatic way. And so this is a family story. This is my father's story that's been told around the dinner table for many years, and very grateful to have shared this story back 10 plus years ago in a few documentaries, one of which was written and produced by Rory Kennedy, the youngest daughter of Robert F. Kennedy. And that documentary was called The Last Days in Vietnam. And so here we are today. We're sharing this family story that my father had written through the years here in the U.S. once everything settled down, and it was written and published in Vietnamese newspapers. And so to honor my father and to put as we all know, a story is written in a newspaper, a few days later, the newspaper gets recycled. And so in honor of my father, we wanted to put all of that together. And finally, we have two versions, both in Vietnamese, the original writing, and then the new one, which is translated into U.S. And so this is out on all platforms. Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
This is going to be required summer reading for me.
Yeah, it's pretty thick.
Yes.
What we'll talk about today, and what I've shared in the past, the documentary is really chapter one, that last 48, hours of the fall, and but the other chapters, my dad shares war stories, love stories, political messages in there as well, pre and post 50 years ago. So
yeah. It seems like his whole life's work, his philosophy, the way he felt about life and his time in the service, it's all there. So
what we'll share as we talk through are pictures that are not in the book itself. So you and your audience will have pictures that are exclusive to just this conversation, as opposed to a few of the pictures that are in the book.
Oh, wonderful.
It'll be fun.
Let's talk about April 29th, 1975, about those last days of Saigon. I'm just going to turn it over to you, Miki, so that our listeners can bear witness to the story and the history that you want to share.
Yeah, so for many of the listeners that may not be aware of 50 plus years ago and beyond, Vietnam War occurred. Vietnam as a country is a very highly desired territory, borders the Pacific Ocean there, and has been occupied many years by the French and a little bit by the Japanese and China as well. And then from the early 60s onward, the conflict, the war that my dad was a part of to basically fight back communism. And so we'll pivot right into the presentation here, and then we'll get going.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to start the story with just who this man was. As we see in the documentary and many other media images through television and magazines and newspapers in the past, the political side, the macro side of the war. But this particular story, it narrows down to just basically one man and what he went through, what he saw through his own eyes. And that's basically where I'm coming in from, is just one man's viewpoint and his experience. And so I start out with this first slide just to talk about who this man was and how he was raised by my grandfather's parents and the country itself. And so, father born in 1940 and valued education, family. By this time, early 60s, he finished high school and then college. Grew up towards the rural countryside and saw a lot of things that shouldn't be seen, just in a war-torn country like this. And so had an opportunity to join the Air Force and went through training, went through testing, and was qualified. In the early 60s, had a chance to come to the U.S. And stay for a long time and train on various helicopters, as we see in the picture here. And they had a chance to study, obviously, English so that we can learn, the tactical aspects of flying these helicopters. And so my dad loved his country and wanted to see freedom for and liberty, the things that we value in any part of the world. And so he joined and was able to take on the adventure of coming to the U.S. and learning a new skill. Fast forward to the last few weeks of April, and for many years leading up to this point, my father knew that the chances of coming out of this situation a good way was probably not going to turn out. As we know, a few years prior to 75, the U.S. government pulled out, U.S. troop. As we mentioned earlier in the conversation today, the protests here in the U.S., the unfavorable reaction to all this forced the government to reduce the resources in the war and the conflict, and left the South Vietnamese military and the army struggling to maintain that independence and freedom from communism. And so it finally crescendoed up to this point here where April 28th, 29th, we see iconic images of the communist tanks rolling into the city capital and basically taking over overnight. Up to on the last few weeks during this moment here, my father moved our family. Back then, I was just 6.5. Got a younger brother, Mecca, and a baby sister at the time, Mina, 8 months old. We had lived on the military base all my life. I grew up on a military base. I had a bunker in the back of the house, and as a kid, just climbing on trees and jumping on equipment here and there, and it's just a normal part of my life growing up. But towards the last few weeks there, my father obviously was unsafe to stay on the barracks there. He got bombed all the time during the last few months, and so moved our family to my grandma's house in downtown Saigon. And I remember the last few nights, the 27th to 28th, laying underneath the bed, laying low, and because hearing bombing and shelling around the city, a lot of that happening, and just very tense moment. And my father said to my mom, if things go bad, get the bags ready, get things ready, and we'll come and get you. And we're trying to figure out a way out, because he knew that if he would have gotten captured, it would have been either death or sent to re-education camp, jail, basically, with his rank. So when you watch the actual film documentary, you'll see many of the videos of people just trying to scramble, trying to jump the embassy wall. The iconic picture there on the far left with the little Huey helicopter, and people scurrying up there to find a way out. And that's the premise of Rory's documentary. It's just focused around the embassy. My dad had the same idea, where at this moment in time, it was just him in his helicopter. He called it his horse, and it was a Wild West at this time, and you had to do what you had to do because all of his commanding officers and the leadership of the South Army knew their fate and knew exactly that if they stayed behind, they would have gotten captured. And so they all took off with their family. And at this point, my father said, "Hey guys," to his crew, "Hey, we're on our own now." And what he did was, with one Chinook, flew into the city and landed the Chinook in front of my grandma's house. Back then, she had a little playfield big enough for a Chinook to land in. If the audience is aware, Chinook is the largest helicopter fleet in military, the large two-rotor helicopter. You can hear that when you're driving down the road or on the freeway, if you're around military base. It's caused a lot of commotion in the neighborhood, but he landed and told one of the crew members to open up the rear hatch, and we ran out of the house and into the back. And my mom was carrying baby sister, and we all ran to the back of the helicopter, and he immediately took off. Didn't want to stay too long. He could have gotten shot down if he stayed too long. So we got the heck out of there. And the thinking at this time was to find some safer location further south of the main city. And so he rendezvoused up with a few of his other crew members who picked up their family as well. And so the whole squadron consolidated further south. And the first thing was load up on food, on gas, and just made sure all the rations were filled up. And perhaps fly south, find an island, find something remote, and just lay low. And so at this moment in time, he was monitoring his radio. And the idea at this time was, well, instead of flying south, let's maybe head out to the Pacific. He knew that there's still a U.S. Navy, U.S. activity out in the Pacific there. And so he headed east out towards the Pacific, not knowing exactly if there was anything possible to land on, or perhaps maybe a larger carrier to land on, but it was just a hope and a prayer at this point. Head out in that direction. But fortunately, he sees a ship way out in the distance. It's tiny, and so he's figured, well, let's go check it out, and hopefully it's big enough where we can land on it. And that's what he did. So headed out quickly in that direction. As he sees it, he slows down and immediately looks down and finds this particular ship. And so we see in the video, Dan Lucero captured the video, and some of the pictures that we'll see here is from Mr. Campiano, from both crewmen from the USS Kirk. I just give credit to the video and the photography. But my father continued to, hover around this ship. Found out many years later on the name of the ship was the USS Kirk, and the captain, Mr. Paul Jacobs. And we'll talk about the incredible captain in the next few slides here, but obviously it's simply too small. And we see another image here that he's approaching. He's circling. That's my father up there, and you can see the crewman below just kind of like pushing him back, giving him the signal. He's just too big to land here. And this image here is zoomed in, but you can see in the middle window my mother holding a baby sister up to the window. It's just communicating, hey, we've got kids and females and kids on board here. Don't shoot us down. Because at this moment in time, it's very tense. The folks below, the crew, didn't know if this was an enemy coming out at them, and so they had to take precaution and make sure that everything was okay. And so, yeah, that's the picture of my mom holding up baby sister up there. And we continue. My father just never gave up, just continuing to circle the ship, trying to figure out some way to get help. We also see many of these images in the magazines and the media, where many of the other pilots had the same idea as my dad. But in this case, they had access to the smaller Hueys. And with these helicopters, you can land on the back of this particular ship, the USS Kirk, and the family members would come out. But yeah, in my dad's case, the Chinook was just too big. And so here's another image that we see of the captain. And he's just an outstanding individual, very compassionate. He was he's kind of a leader with his guys, showing leadership through action rather than commanding in the in the post up high. But yeah, we see him here helping the team out, pushing smaller helicopters over and then giving access to the facility for other helicopters to land as well. So he's just throughout this whole story here is all my father is my hero in the most absolute way. But there's other heroes throughout this whole story that saw just a big heart, a big compassion. And Captain Jacob here is one of those individuals along with his crew. So without them, not only our family, but I'm sure many other families' stories and life path would have been different. I mean, he didn't, he didn't have to help. He didn't have to break sort of like process and protocol to take in refugees and take in folks that were looking for help. And we'll talk about the history of all of this and how it all came about later on in the story. But eventually, after circling several times and not giving up, my dad was able to communicate to the captain and the crew below the intent of how we're going to figure this out as a team. And so many things that we talk about here is just themes of not only leadership, heroism, themes of communication and collaboration, and of course, in this particular slide, heroes stepping up to the moment. Captain Jacob was one of them. So after talking and communicating with each other, the idea was to keep the ship moving at a steady rate forward, because the wind, the swell could have pushed the ship, floating around, making it act erratic. The captain kept the ship straight ahead, while at the same time my father had to fly backwards, looking over his shoulders to maintain a safe distance. Because mind you, again, the USS Kirk here, I found out later on that it was a submarine destroyer. Its task, its mission, its goal was to search, hunt, and destroy submarines. And so it had all of the expensive equipment, the sonar, the radar, all of the equipment, the highest of tech equipment back at that time. And so my father knew not to bump into it or anything like that. He just tried to keep a safe distance, while at the same time give the opportunity to the folks inside the helicopter, family members and crewmen and their families, their girlfriends, the chance to do the next maneuver, which was to basically jump out at this time. There's no way for the Chinook to land on the back deck. And the only way to get out of here was to hover behind the stern, the rear of the ship, and to hover 13, 15, 17 feet above, above the deck. Mm-hmm. And we see in the picture here a painting by Adam Colts here. And then the other picture here on the far right, done by the New York Times illustration of my mother dropping a baby, down into the folks below. One of the individuals that caught us, his name is Mr. Kent Shipman. And many years later on, we finally had a reunion with the ship and the crew. And this was in 2010. And Mr. Kent Shipman comes out, introduces himself as we come into the convention hall for this reunion. And he goes, "Hey, I'm the gentleman that caught you." Very emotional, very just circling back and meeting everyone, from that standpoint. So at this time, I remember jumping, looking over the starboard, the right door, and looking over and jumping over. And all of the, brother, families, and crew member jumped over. Dad kept the Chinook hovering steady while everyone hopped out. And then he told the co-pilot to make one last check in the back, make sure everything was clear. And so co-pilot said clear, give a thumbs up. And then my father told the co-pilot to jump also out onto the deck. And the last thing that we see is my father hovering away from the ship. And so they quickly told all of the civilians, kids, to go inside. They didn't want anybody running out in the back. So that's the last thing that I remember seeing. My dad was just hovering away. And the years, as we'll continue on, but throughout the years, hearing my dad talk about this moment was one of those family stories that people share in their families around dinner tables or anytime that my dad would meet up with his other military friends, they would share war stories and mission stories, battle stories. And this was one of those stories that they would, how did you, what happened to you and what happened to your family and how did you get here? And this is a story that I heard growing up and what he did next here. And what he did next here is basically the thought was obviously he's not going to fly back to base because his family was all on board here. And he go back there, he's going to get put in jail, get killed. And so he had to figure out some way to escape from his horse. And so he flew away about 100 yards or so from the ship. And the picture on the left there shows the younger days here. But he had his sidearm and his one-piece flak jacket with straps. What he did here, he hovered for 5 or so minutes, just trying to get down to his undergarment and had to hover there for a bit. And so, yeah, he got down to his undergarment. And by this time, the captain of the ship sent down a little skiff to get ready. Either it was going to be a mission or a recovery.
All right.
Yeah, at this point. And so my dad was ready, and he gave the thumbs up. And so he opened up the port access window on his left, and with his right leg, he kicked the control so that it would lean the helicopter to the right while he jumped to his left. That's basically what he did. Was after he, allowed the members and crew members to jump, he was the last guy to jump. And this is one of those iconic images from the Navy took, Mr. Capiano. That little red dot there is my father. And then he noted, the salt water was so buoyant, they kept pushing him back up several times, and he kept diving. But eventually was able to get far away enough where he was, able to just that first few seconds of an explosion behind him. He just wanted to get as far as he could underneath the water because the fiberglass and the prop that could have landed on his head, or the dynamics of the helicopter could have flipped back on top of him. Fortunately, was able to swim quickly away from, the explosion behind him there. And this was another part of the video. We see in the video where that's how we, he's bopping there waiting for the skiff to come. But that's how we started here in America. It's just a pair of shirt and shorts and a big dream. It was at this moment in time here, it was just years, months, days of fear and anxiety and not knowing exactly what's going to happen next to you and your family. The country that you knew, the freedom that you knew growing up was not going to end well. But in this particular case, this moment here where he's in the water, it's safe now. It's like there's just that moment of relief and the anxiety and being rescued by the captain and the crew was just like, okay. Fortunately, the last chapter of this particular history of Vietnam and how it, for him and his family ended up well. It opened up a new chapter of unknowns. It's having to start all over again, but you knew that at least you had a chance, And so we see the pictures here of father, and he retired from Boeing in 1999, 2000 timeframe. And I wanted to do something to honor my father and his sacrifice, his hard work, all of those things that I just, if I can be half the man that he is, I'd be doing okay. But for his retirement, I asked my mom, hey, where did you keep his pastel? This is a 70s pastel shirts and boxer shorts there. And she saved it through the years. And that's how we got started here, in America. So I grabbed it from my mom, put a little keepsake box together, and there's images of that on our website there below. Many other images of, father and family stories on the website. But I gave that to him, as a retirement gift. My grandma had saved all of his medals and she kept it in a plastic bag and he hid it underneath the fireplace, ashes, because if they found out that, grandma and the family was a son that was, by this time he was a lieutenant colonel. And so she didn't want to, stay low from that. So, but he kept all the medals, saved all the medals that he had and gave it to him. And the picture there on the top right there is him standing there talking with Mr. Jacobs there. And so just at this moment in time, he was just so relieved, so happy, so relieved that finally, years and months and days of just worry and stress. And he'd been shot down a few times on his helicopter on missions in his career. And so finally, he was just like, okay, I'm finally safe now. And this is basically the first step of finding freedom and just gratitude. I want to end this slide with just at this moment, just the gratitude of the universe above, making sure that everything was okay, his family was okay, he was okay. The gratitude of folks like, again, the captain and the many other folks along this particular journey. And so this is the last slide I wanted to share in that 10 years ago, in 2015, as I mentioned, told him that last days in Vietnam, and he got nominated for an Oscar in 2015. So we're very honored around sharing that. And then knowing that in 2025 here, in the next on April 29th here, shortly coming up here, would be 50 years. And so again, wanted to honor my father by putting this book together for him and his grandkids and their grandkids, so that 200 years later on, they will know exactly how they came. This is our Ellis Island story for those that, from a Vietnamese culture and upbringing and heritage. This is our Ellis Island story. And this is one particular family story. There's a lot of other refugee stories, folks trying to escape communism from 75, 80s, the boat people story, many horrific stories. But this was our family story. And I just, again, honored to be given the opportunity to share it. I get themes of courage and themes of leadership, resiliency, and overcoming obstacles is all part of this whole book that my father wrote.
Yeah, and all of those themes were present just on April 29th, 1975, because of your father's heroic ethics, all of that, Miki was present. And, thank you, first of all, for sharing those photos with our audience. I'm honored that you use this platform to do this, and I've been honored to bear witness to your father's story and also your family's story. And that picture with Captain Jacobs and your dad, I mean, that one could be framed, and we can use that as this is how the world should operate in terms of shared values, in terms of individuals who share the same goal, the same passion. And I was watching that documentary and watching the interview with both, I think, Paul Jacobs and Hugh Doyle. You could see the compassion flowing out of them. And also, I think the sadness that they could not get everybody out of Saigon during those last days. And that's something you don't see a lot in terms of what you hear about the horror stories of the war. And there are certainly horrific stories to tell, but it's those moments of compassion that we can look for, that we can hang on to, and we can use as a model for how the world should really be operating at this point.
Yeah.
Your dad and Captain Jacobs, I think, struck me as having some very similar qualities. They both led by example.
Yep.
Father was right out in front. Captain Jacobs was right out in front with his men. Your father, in and of himself, he wanted to make sure everybody else was safe before him. And I'll tell you, when I was watching the Chinook just crash down and him jumping from it, I'm thinking, I know he's going to survive because he did survive. But looking at it, I'm thinking, how did he survive? He landed, I think Hugh Doyle said, about 20 feet from the Chinook. Yeah. He could have been really torn apart with the blades, but he survived, and he was meant to survive.
My father was just a skilled pilot as well, and so everything had to just align. The stars had to align, and we're here, and we're blessed, and we're lucky to share this story. So, yeah.
And I know he had how many? About 100? Was it 157 people in the Chinook?
No.
Was it 157?
No, okay. The Chinook is capable of handling a lot of folks in terms of cargo and lifting up heavy artillery tanks, all of those things. So during that moment, around less than 20 people.
Okay.
Yeah.
there was 157. Maybe what I read was that it could hold more than
Yeah,
it could hold more the people than he actually carried that day. So,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All
And
right. My,
so, no, go ahead, Dave.
no, I was just going to say my apologies
Oh, no, no,
for
no,
the
no problem.
oversight.
Yeah. We were on that ship for less than 24 hours. From there on, another U.S. Navy offloaded us, our family, and many other Vietnamese family went to another ship. The USS Kirk stayed behind to continue to surveil, but we went on to another ship from to Guam, Wake, and then eventually to Camp Pendleton, a Marine base north of San Diego. And we were there going through the immigration paperwork, legal process. One of the things my dad was sharing was if he had to do it over again, he would have told his co-pilot to give him time to hold
Yep.
the Chinook steady while he's taking off his stuff. And the other part of this was he wished that he would have saved his military ID and all of that because he, took everything apart. It was just down to his undergarments. So it would have made the whole paperwork a little easier. But otherwise, yeah, throughout the summer, early fall, being in Camp Pendleton for a few months, and then finally a church here in this outskirts of Seattle sponsored our family. And that's how we ended up here in the Seattle area. While being on the ship for 24 hours, there's no way of getting the name or just name of the ship, name of the captain. It's a lost part of our history. One chapter, you flip to the next chapter, it's like, okay, we got to start life all over again. All right, it's time to survive. It's time to my dad knew decent enough English to to get through. My mom zero English, and had to start all over again. Fortunately, through hard work, and my father went back and studied electronics,
Mhm.
and family. I started first grade here in the U.S. Quickly had to assimilate to the language and the culture and everything, and just try to survive. Starting a new chapter all over again, surviving.
What were, if any, the challenges that you and your family experienced as trying to assimilate into Western culture?
Well, the first one, of course, is the communication. I think that's, with any refugee immigration stories that we see today and throughout history, it's just the communication. Communication is absolutely one of the most important things in terms of just um, getting to know each other at a human level and being able to communicate in the nuance of just social interaction. And so that's the biggest part. I know for me as a kid, I relied on my parents to take on the burden of having to relearn and survive and find work and find employment. Uh, Myself as a kid growing up is just pick up language pretty quickly. And so started first grade and quickly had to figure out ways to make friends and talk with the other kids around me. I saw my fair share of racism and being called all sorts of derogatory things growing up, but we figure out a way to survive through that and get through that. And despite all of those things, just the opportunity here to be in America, to be in the U.S., and to live under a country where you're able to, go as far as your dreams will take you and the hard work will take you. As I said before, once we got resettled, my father got into electronics and all of that. He wrote stories. About 13 years ago, roughly around there, uh, my father developed dementia and Alzheimer's. And in 2009, my father was in the thick of Alzheimer's and dementia. In 2009, I'm sitting at work, and my mom gets an email and she forwards it to me. Her English is okay by this time. She gets an email and she forwards it to me. I'm looking at this email and I scroll it was forwarded on. I scroll all the way to the bottom and I read at the bottom that it was sent by a .gov email. So we knew it was a government email, and I found out who wrote it. It was from Mr. Jan Herman. Back then he was a U.S. Navy historian.
Mhm.
And he was tasked with trying to, understand what worked, what didn't when it came to naval warfare in particular the Vietnam War. He did some research around this particular ship in such a way that the premise was the ship was meant to, it was a submarine destroyer. The objective was to find submarines, and put it out of commission.
Mm-hmm.
But it ended up being a humanitarian story, of which was led by Captain Paul Jacobs and his crew, saving, again, not only our family, but hundreds of others that seeked his help. Mr. Jan Herman wrote a story on that, and he wanted to find that one pilot that did the ditch, the maneuver. And so they put out the word to the Vietnamese military community all over the U.S. And again, my dad wrote many of the stories in many of the Vietnamese newspapers, not only here in Seattle, but in other parts of the country. And so he had military pilots and friends all over the U.S. And it started in Virginia. He got forwarded it on to my mom, and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, we're looking for this pilot that did this particular maneuver, and we want to find out who he is. And so I'm reading it, I'm thinking, yeah, this is, my dad shares this story, and there was no other Chinook pilot that did this in his community, Vietnamese helicopter community, Vietnamese veterans community. And so I replied back to Mr. Hammond, if you're looking for the pilot that did this ditch on my father, and I ran home, took a picture of my dad holding, by this time he's a senior, he's holding up that keepsake box that I had mentioned, right, with his shorts and his shirt. As a matter of fact, let me share you this one more screen.
Okay.
In that is interesting. We see in the picture there, a particular slide is basically coming full circle, where on April 29th, my father finds the USS Kirk. And this was some of the Vietnamese reunion, him standing there in the mid-90s, I think this picture, CH-47 back there. But as a retirement gift in 2001, the same shirts and boxer shorts made together, and took a picture of this and sent it to Mr. Jan Herman, because on July 5th, I saw that email, July 5th, 2009. So basically, it's coming full circle for our family story, in that finally the ship, the crew finds my father. And we got an invitation. Mr. Jan Herman finally was able to get the whole story together. He wrote a book called The Lucky Few. And a year later, in 2010, the U.S. Navy, under his direction, created the first documentary where I was able to share this family story. It's a U.S. Navy documentary, but it's also named The Lucky Few. They invited our family, and by this time, my father was in his wheelchair. He couldn't talk, but he was in a wheelchair, and out to Washington, D.C., the Virginia area. And it was a convention, and came in, and earlier in the story, I said that Kent Chipman was one of those men that came out. And we pictures of him on our website there. Came out and saluted my dad, and I looked at my baby sister, now an adult, and looked at her, and he goes, I'm the one that caught you. And so it was just a very emotional moment. And as we finally saw the documentary that the U.S. Navy produced at the reunion, and then finally Captain Paul Jacobs invites my father up. And so we wheeled him up to the podium. The captain is like many years older than my dad, but at that moment in time in 2010, all his mental faculties were there, and presented my father with an honorary USS Kirk Association commemorative gifts. And the crowd was clapping, and I'm standing behind my dad, and I can see my dad trying to wiggle out of his wheelchair. He had enough energy to stand up out of the wheelchair. As the crowd was clapping, my dad gave it a salute. He couldn't say anything. He knew what was going on. And he wanted to say thank you to the captain and crew, for their compassion in helping him and his family. So it was just a very emotional reunion.
Yeah, and just a very emotional story to begin with, and one that's got so many beautiful subcategories to it, with courage, with valor, with honor, with compassion. There's just so much to your dad's story, his heroic actions during the last days in Saigon, and it's just, that story is going to carry over for generations and generations and generations.
Yes, that's what we hope. And yeah, a lot of things get passed down from generation after generation, but this story as put, through this book, I'm just glad I can pass it on to my kids and their kids and so on. But it's also, again, a story that has all the themes that you mentioned that can resonate and be applicable to anybody going through their moment of obstacles and trying to find a new chapter in their life. And perhaps it could help inspire others out there going through their own personal story as well. And I know your background, you teach about mental health, and you're a champion of just being mentally
Mhm.
going through anxiety or depression or things like that. We know of many that we've talked to about this are veterans
Yeah.
and the things that they have to struggle with in terms of PTSD and many of the things that they've seen that humans shouldn't
No.
should not go through. And so I want to acknowledge you and the work that you've done to help others, may it be veterans or non-veterans, going through their own personal struggles. So uh, yeah,
Well,
thank you
thank
to
you.
you. Thank you to you.
Well, thank you. And it's interesting as you were talking about growing up and seeing the horrors of war in Vietnam. And I remember I was working with a student, not in a mental health capacity, but she was one of my students. And I also teach a death, dying, and bereavement course at Utica University.
Mm.
She was from Bosnia. One of the assignments that I had in the initial incarnation of the course was to have them write their living obituary.
Mm.
Basically, charting the life that they wanted to lead with the legacy that they wanted to leave from beginning to end. And one student was from Bosnia. She had herself dying at a young age,
Mm.
which initially floored me. But then she explained, she goes, I grew up around war. I grew up around my city and my country getting bombed. I grew up during the Bosnian Serbian conflict.
Yeah.
And she said, I woke up every day thinking that today could be my last day. And when she came to the United States, she still carries that mentality because she says, any day I wake up could be my last day. And that was because of what the horrors of war ingrained in her, that any day, any moment
Yeah.
be your last moment, depending on what's going on. And I can also imagine individuals who grew up in war probably cherish their lives and cherish each day and are grateful for what they have because of what they've already seen and been through.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't imagine. When you're 5.5 or 6 year old back then, you had no clue what that meant. But
No.
somebody as an adult like my mom or my father or your colleague or friend in Bosnia growing up not knowing that, imagine the amount of anxiety and the fear in living in that state every day. That's just, yeah, that can take a toll on the unknown, the anxiety. Incredible.
Yeah, and I had a lot of admiration for her just for her resilience and
Yeah.
for her really, it takes some of us till the end of our lives to realize that life is precious.
Mm.
And she realized that when she was 6 or 7 years old, how precious life is and that life shouldn't be taken for granted. And that each day shouldn't be taken for granted.
Yeah. And you work a lot with the veteran community, is that right?
My practice in and of itself was a generalist practice.
Mm.
I did have some veterans. I did work with a lot of individuals who had PTSD who were not necessarily veterans, but individuals who had grown up with severe emotional abuse and who were victims of sexual abuse that also had PTSD. I did work with a percentage of individuals who were veterans, and they enriched my life just with their stories, their courage, and allowing me to be present for whatever parts of their stories they were willing to share with me.
Mm.
And I really appreciated that trust.
Yeah, it's again, just thank you for your service in the community and the things that you advocate and talk about. So, uh, I studied engineering in college, and so, but in terms of just mental health, it's a different healing process, I guess.
It is. And I think, requires one as a therapist that we be patient and realize that therapeutic relationship is an ongoing relationship, that trust isn't going to be automatically built, that's going to occur over time, and that we empower individuals to share their stories to the extent that they wish to disclose. For me, I think it's important, whether you're working with a veteran or anybody else, to be able to bear witness to their story, allow them to share what they need to share. Like wasn't concerned about asking you questions as you were doing the narrative of your father's story with the last days in Saigon and the context in terms of what he was like as a dad, what it was like growing up in Vietnam. I wanted to create a space where to allow that story to occur. And then, then share my observations when you were done. And that's one of the things that I think with anybody with mental illness, I think it's important. I know one of the things with veterans that I've learned is when they, especially if they've done combat duty, I never would press them for details in terms of how many individuals did you kill? Did you kill people in battle? If they wanted to share that with me, I let them. But I allowed them to share what they were comfortable sharing about their combat duty. Encourage them. I would also encourage, like, if they just were coming back from combat duty, get a comprehensive medical and physical evaluation and psychiatric evaluation, particularly for TBI, any type of persistent concussive symptoms, anything like that, and an evaluation for PTSD or anything else. As therapists, we can provide a safe space to allow an individual to share their stories. We can do a lot of really great evidence-based therapy, such as cognitive behavioral treatment. But it's also important for the families to get support if they're living with an individual who's a combat veteran, and helping them adjust to their coming home, and also peer support. And if you're working with the veterans organization or the VA, work in conjunction with the VA to make sure that their needs are met. And those are the things that I've learned in terms of working with the veterans that I've had in contact with me.
Excellent. Excellent.
So, and I am grateful for every veteran, anybody in the military, and I'm grateful to your father for what he did to protect my fellow Americans and our fellow humans, to do what he did. And who knows, Miki could have been one of my ancestors that he protected, one of my American ancestors that I didn't even know about. So for that, I'm grateful. And for everybody who has served our country, I'm very grateful for their service and very grateful for the safety and security they provide us here.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, my father is my hero, but I see many heroes throughout this whole narrative, this whole story, just along the way. The compassion of just one human being to the next. It doesn't matter the skin of your color, or this color of your skin, or where you just like, if you somebody that you see is struggling one way or the other, figure out some way to help and uplift each other.
I know you mentioned earlier that if you were 1/8 as good as your father, you'd be happy. From my contact with you, Miki, and the way that you shared your father's story, and if they've shared it with honor and have preserved the story with dignity and have ensured that his story gets preserved for generations to come, I think you've probably exceeded the 1/8 by 6/8. So let's call 7/8. But and also, when I was looking at your dad, looking at you, I could see the resemblance. I could see a lot of the shadow of your father in you.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. I'm just blessed and honored to be my father's son and to continue to share this story and to keep his family story to my kids. And if it touches anybody, my neighbors or the folks around me, fantastic. We're here to share history. And in this particular history, it ended up being not only suspenseful, dramatic, but also all of those things that we would hope and value in terms of our neighbors, just compassion, and where it calls for, be a hero, right? Yeah. Where it calls for, be a hero to yourself, to your family, to your community. And so we need more heroes, in this world.
Yeah, we need more heroes and we need more peacemakers.
Absolutely.
So, Miki, my last question for you is, if people want to find out more about the book, more about the documentary, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The website that I had at the bottom, my last name, nguyenvanba.com. I know it's a rather long URL, but a simple Google search, Last Days in Vietnam, or things like that. The book is on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and your traditional stuff. So I'm just so happy to again be given the opportunity to share with you and your audience this family story.
And I also meant know, because as people pick up the book, they're going to see it's about 520 pages long. But the book is designed where they can just jump to certain chapters that kind of resonate with them, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The stories that my dad wrote was a span of over 20 years. And so I don't think that he had any sort of intention. Well, my mom and I knew that he wanted to put a book together, but over a 20-year span of project, and it just would have been very difficult for him in that case. And so I knew after a while, in the past year, we've found many of his Vietnamese writings on Word document and was able to find, okay, let's put it all together. And so you made a great point. These are all short stories. They're love stories. There's something in it for, for the gals out there, right? The romantic story, long lost veteran has to go off to war and his girl's behind. And that love lost kind of stories. There's stories of betrayal, your friends turning their back on you. He had to deal with many of those stories. There's political stories. There's communism stories. God, there's just a whole wealth of different stories. So you can hop around different chapters as you see fit. But
all right. Miki, thank you so much for spending time with me and my audience today. It was such a pleasure having you on. It was an honor for me to bear witness to your family's history and story. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, Dave. And I want to thank you as well for your service into the mental health community and in helping others in platforms like your podcast to let the audience know that you've got folks that can help along the journey. So well done to you.
Thank you. And with that, that's a wrap on another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, wishing you peace.